let's begin with former Representative David Dreier. Why did this film need to be made?
It was 6 years ago right now that I chose to leave Washington. And as I was preparing to leave, I got a call from my friend of 35 years, Bill Mundell, who said, we need to make a movie about the relationship between China and the United States, and I want you to be part of it. And so I, at that point, began thinking about what needed to be done. And I said then what Bill just said. I said it at the outset. We need to shatter myths that exist in the United States about China and myths that exist in China about the United States. And this film clearly demonstrates that. Whether it's this notion that the United States of America is victimized by China because they're sitting there plotting to take all of our jobs, when in fact, as we saw with jobs moving from the Midwest in China and a shoe factory to Ethiopia, China is in many ways victimized by globalization, just as the United States of America is victimized by globalization. And I will tell you that we have very serious problems. Very serious problems, and Clayton understands that as well as anyone. My good friend Lenny Sands, who was one of the first supporters of the center here, was one of the top members of President Bush's Export Council. The notion of doing everything that we can to enhance the trade relationship, as Bill said in the movie, the idea of 600 million consumers in China, twice the size of the United States population, being poised to purchase goods and services is something that is absolutely essential, and it's something that we need to pursue. And so I just, in thinking about it, wanted to be part of that effort. Now, having said that, I don't in any way diminish the very serious challenges that exist in what is obviously the world's most important bilateral relationship. Shortly before he passed away, the founding father of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, I was in Singapore, and I wasn't able to meet with him. I had hoped to, but he was too ill at that time. And I met with his foreign minister, who looked to me, and we were talking at that point about the chemical attacks taking place in Syria. And I would say the same thing today as we talk about the terrible news of what happened today, of the threats of bombing two former presidents of the United States, a former Secretary of State, one of my former colleagues in the United States Congress, and others. Very serious issue. As we look at the challenges that exist around the world, the foreign minister of Singapore looked to me and said, remember, what is most urgent is not always what is most important. What is most urgent is not always what is most important. It is absolutely urgent that we deal with these issues that exist, with Jamal Khashoggi's killing in Istanbul, Turkey, and to deal with the aftermath of the tragic, horrible news we got today of people trying to kill our leaders. But the single most important bilateral relationship that exists in the world today is the relationship between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America. And so we need to do everything that we can to strengthen ties between our two countries. I like to say regularly that every day I try to think about how I can make the United States of America more dependent on China and how I can make China more dependent on the United States of America, because as Evan Osnos says, we are inextricably tied. Now, having said that too, I will say that on June 4th of 1989, when we saw the horrible, horrible tragedy in Tiananmen Square, I, with 4 of my colleagues, led a march from the U.S. Capitol to the Chinese embassy to protest that, the week of June 4th, 1989. 4 weeks later, on the floor of the United States Congress, interestingly enough, with the help of Richard Milhous Nixon, who was preparing talking points for me, I was one of the leaders in the debate to renew most favored nation trading status was with the People's Republic of China. So those who would argue, again, as Bill points out in the movie, that the answer to this issue is for us to disengage, for us to divorce ourselves when we are in fact inextricably tied, would be a terrible, terrible move. And so as I go through the litany of issues, as Jim Baker mentioned in the film, intellectual property theft, the development in the South China Sea, the treatment of Uyghurs, you can go Falun Gong, all of these issues need to be on the forefront, but we don't have a chance to address those or to put into place what I truly believe in, and that is the universalism of self-determination, the rule of law, political pluralism, and the development of democratic institutions, which I still aspire to because I do believe it's universal. But we don't do that by doing what some of my former colleagues in the United States Congress have argued, and that is to try and turn the People's Republic of China into another Soviet Union and to create another Cold War. So that's what really led me to get involved with this.
Thank you. One of the great lines that comes at the end about the accidental diplomats. And one of the things that I wanted to recognize is we have a lot of purposeful diplomats as well as accidental diplomats, the people involved in business. We have Professor Xu Xin, who is the leader of Jewish studies in China. He's among the audience. I wanted to congratulate Bill. This is I think maybe the first film to feature 2 trustees from the University of Southern California. We have a third trustee, Ming Xie, with us.
We had that in
all
mind.
planned, all planned to come here tonight. But when I didn't meet you 35 years ago. I only met you a few years ago, but it was before, and you had a trailer already. This film was ready. And then something changed that changes this film in dramatic ways. Donald Trump. Maybe you can talk about how this film changed.
Yeah, I think, first of all, 95% of the principal photography was completed before Donald Trump was even remotely on the horizon. And we had anguishing sessions, internal sessions, the director and I, about what to do with this. One of the things we were determined not to do is to make this film about Donald Trump. So, and what is interesting, and what I tell Chinese audiences on a regular basis in China, is that the anti-Chinese sentiment that exists in the United States existed well before Donald Trump. He perhaps more than anyone else has capitalized on it politically. But one should not assume that that anti-Chinese sentiment does not exist in the United States. And I think for us, then it really became a question of making it clear that, you know, he was a relevant actor. We had no idea how relevant he was going to be. We didn't understand that he was going to take it to the level. I mean, to me, I feel there is a slow motion catastrophe unfolding between Washington and Beijing right now. And the worst of it from as an American, from an American perspective, is I really feel we're taking a knife to a gunfight. I mean, the Chinese in the last 100 years have turned inward twice. One at the turn of the 20th century, secondly under Mao. And both of those times, it was an utter disaster for China. The big difference right now is that they've developed their internal economy. And China could probably turn inward right now and grow at the same rate for the next, decade or so. It could probably, and that would be a very bad thing for the United States for several reasons. But principal reason is that we invested in building the middle class of China. We are just now on the edge of being able to reap the rewards. And what a shame it would be if after having made this investment, we don't get the rewards. We don't get the job payback. So
now that it is quite important. China's exports only account for 2% of its GDP. Only a quarter of that comes to the United States. And so the developing internal market is, of course, all important. But that leads to the questions about market access and things like that that we might talk about. Bill, if I could ask you, the American dream comes up a couple of times. Mimo has it, and he's realizing it in China. There's no mention explicitly of the Chinese dream. And maybe you could say something about that, how that, because that is so prominent in terms of propaganda and these sorts of things. And that dream maybe doesn't fit this movie because this movie focuses on individuals and individual experiences and individual choices.
Well, I think it does actually fit the movie because I think the China dream isn't really very different than the American dream in terms of at the individual level, what people want and desire and so forth. Now we have a disagreement over how our governments achieve that dream. In the United States, we achieve that dream by offering maximum freedom to our people. In China, that is not the case. But the end goal of family values, as you saw in this film, very powerful. Chinese have very powerful family values. And that end goal and what the average family in China wants and what the average family in America wants is absolutely similar.
Okay.
Obviously, beyond the individual level, I mean, I think what Clayton is alluding to is this question of what is China's plan for the United States of America? I mean, is that kind of when you're talking about sort of?
Well, China's plan, and there's reference made to that. Tung and others make reference to
the history or?
Going right, China on top.
Yeah, Tung Siwei.
China rejuvenated.
Right, and then Wan Jianlin's line about this 200-year period of time we've had this little blip is what it is, and so the implication is it's Chinese hegemony, and obviously that creates a challenge for us. As I said a moment ago, I believe in the universalism of those four things. I mean, self-determination, the rule of law, political pluralism, the development of democratic institutions. Those things I feel strongly about. So that's a challenge that we have in the relationship. And we have many Chinese Americans, as you point out, Clayton, who are here in this room. We all know them all over. And there are people who in the United States are here because of the opportunity that exists here. And so I think that this is one of the issues, as Jim Baker would say, that we need to figure out how to handle. And the question is, how do we handle that? And I think a movie like this, which will be in, as Bill said, on 2,000 screens within the next 4 weeks in China, and it's going to be released here November 2nd. There's going to be another screening for any of your friends who are interested, by the way, in Pasadena. We're going to be doing a screening there on the evening, 2 screenings, 5 and 7 o'clock on the night of the 2nd of November. But so this is what really drove us to do this as a way to, for lack of a better term, to sort of lower the temperature. And then, as you said at the outset, Donald Trump has not done a hell of a lot to lower the temperature on this issue, and that's a bit of an understatement.
But I think on the issue of whether China is seeking a peaceful rise or to become the global hegemon, I mean, that's really the issue. And, my favorite China experts are the ones that say, I don't know, because I don't think anyone knows. I don't even think China knows, to be honest, at this point. So we don't know that, but I think it's not a dilemma, because the American strategy should be the same either way. China is too big to ignore. We can't go our separate ways any longer. But what we should do is harness the strength of China to a point where we can strengthen ourselves. I mean, the classic way to avoid the Thucydides trap, which Graham Allison of Harvard coined that term, is to make sure that the rise of China doesn't mean the decline of the United States. If we can harness China's strength in order to strengthen ourselves, then that's the simplest way to avoid the Thucydides trap. Graham Allison says, when we were at Harvard with him a couple of weeks ago, he said, it will take extreme imagination to avoid the Thucydides trap. I actually disagree. I think this is the easiest way to do it. Now, the second way to do it is, as David just said, to take down the temperature, to turn the tide of public opinion so that you deprive leaders of the ability to act impulsively with impunity. Because as Graham Allison would say, the biggest risk is not that we consciously go into war, but that there's a mistake, there's a misunderstanding, and it quickly escalates. And that can only happen if you have public opinion on your side. I mean, something George Washington said more than 200 years ago is even truer today, which is that if you have public opinion on your side, you can do anything. And if you don't have it on your side, you can do nothing. And the reason Donald Trump is able to do what he's doing with China is because he has public opinion on his side. The purpose of this movie is to, and I'm not Pollyannish about this, it's to make a small dent in shattering myths so that the American people and the Chinese people can become stakeholders in what is arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the world.
So if you want to give you this number, is our goal is to become number 5 and not number 13. Because as Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, has pointed out in the movie, as Thucydides looked at the challenge that Athens posed to Sparta, what happened is we, every time since that, have seen in 12 of 16 cases a shooting war follow when one country begins to transcend another militarily, economically, or geopolitically. And as Bill said in his opening remarks here, I am not going to wring my hands over the fact that a country that is nearly 5 times the population of the United States has a larger economy than the United States of America. It's not going to lead to the ruination of the United States of America.
Yeah, if I could,
Sure.
2 quick interjections on that. First, Graham Allison is probably wrong. This has not panned out since the invention of atomic weapons. That changes the calculation. The danger is still the accidental incident. And certainly the United States will not decide if China rises or not. Many Chinese believe that that it's an American plan to hold China back, but it really, as you suggest, doesn't matter. China's rise will continue more smoothly, more rapidly with the United States, but with America in opposition, it will still continue. And so it's in our interest to do these things. Now, you mentioned in the film this question of suspicion, right? And one of the magic things about the film is how individuals who might have been nervous initially in working, together in Alabama or wherever they were, it wasn't necessarily suspicion, but they weren't comfortable. They didn't know what to expect. Well, we see how individuals work that out. How do countries work that out when we're talking about giant navies, large vessels traveling too close to each other?
Well, they work it out in basically the same way, and we see Donald Trump trying to do that with at least a modicum of hope at the end of the of the movie here. And I personally, I'm a Republican, but I've had very serious problems with Donald Trump's presidency. I make no bones.
One of the points on David Dreier's resume that's so impressive is your support for Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right. Trans-Pacific, in fact, 5 years ago, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in which I advocated China's participation if they could meet all of the requirements necessary in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think would be the largest single free trading bloc in the history of the world before TTIP is done. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I really do believe that we have what is a unique opportunity, but in many ways, government to government, it's done similarly to the way it is with the woman in the plant in Alabama, saying ni hao and drinking Chinese tea. I mean, that is all part of it. I mean, Henry Kissinger demonstrated that. And as I was saying, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger helped to formulate my views going back 3 decades on this question. But that doesn't preempt, some military leader taking precipitous action, which could create what we saw in World War I, that led to war. It was an accidental war.
And so you had Jim Baker, you had Madeleine Albright talking about these questions. What
I
do we get?
think look, there's a huge role for the government here, and I think the government needs, number one, to start managing public opinion. But I don't think public opinion in the United States changes about China until there is a widespread perception that the Chinese are now creating jobs in America. And I'm not talking about a handful of isolated examples. I'm saying that the quickest way, we can't wait for 5 to 10 years for 600 million, middle-class Chinese to reverse the trade deficit with China. I mean, that's an eternity. So we have to do something. The government has to do something to short-circuit it. And the fastest way to settle the job score with China is, as the movie alludes to, by reinvesting the trade surplus in American infrastructure. I mean, President Trump's #1 domestic policy initiative this year is to rebuild American infrastructure. And it's completely dead on arrival. There's no chance that it's going to be funded by the Congress. But this is an avenue where, if we can be creative about this, and the Chinese are doing this. They're just not doing it in America. The whole Belt and Road Initiative, $1 trillion is being devoted to rebuilding, the old Silk Road. Why not have a U.S. belt, U.S. road? Why not have the Chinese rebuild us? It does 2 things. Number one, it strengthens us and therefore avoids the Thucydides trap in the most direct way. But most importantly, it's transformational. It's potentially transformational for U.S. public opinion, because the minute Americans see that the Chinese are building jobs, their whole perception, the modern incarnation of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, is all about the loss of middle-class jobs.
If I could interject on this, some Californians wanted to have a high-speed rail to Las Vegas, and there was some discussion about that. And we've had 2 governors now advocating for high-speed rail, Chinese investment in our state. But that's a case where the Chinese state, intervened. For quite some time, 2/3 of Chinese overseas investment was going to the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. It was going to the rich world. But that didn't fit the Belt and Road Plan, and so that got tightened down. And so we're not getting the same kind of investment. And in fact, we're seeing a retrenchment, including Wanda needing to put some of their properties on the block.
Properties being bid up and creating, an even worse scenario for middle-class Americans.
And the infrastructure development should actually take place, I think, on a national basis for us. I think it should be a national priority. I disagree. I mean, having been in the Congress, I do think that there will be an opportunity for some kind of support, because there is a bipartisan interest in infrastructure development. But when we look at the $20 trillion national debt and all, the notion of figuring out a creative way for Chinese investment in infrastructure development is something that we should do. I think it's also important to note that the argument that a trade imbalance somehow hurts us is one of the most preposterous, outrageous claims around. What is it that we have today in the United States? The lowest unemployment rate in half a century. The lowest unemployment rate in half a century, and we have a huge, huge trade deficit with China. In many ways, the United States economy is strengthened because we are able to consume from throughout the world. And the fact that the world has access to the U.S. consumer market is one of the things that has made us as great and as strong as we are. And so this is another myth that I think needs to be put out there. People wringing their hands on this notion of the problem of imports is crazy. I remember one time having dinner with Alan Greenspan in which he said imports are actually more than half of the equation because of the raw materials that come into the United States.
Yeah, in fact, we at the Institute devoted an entire panel just to the question, to these particular questions, and many in the audience may want to discuss that further. Let me ask just one last question, then we'll go to the audience. And that's, Bill, you've highlighted public opinion. Mm-hmm. And the writer, director, Malcolm Clarke, he says at one point that Americans identified for a number of years in public polling that they put China as one of the 4 top enemies. And that's true, but it's also, I think, grossly misleading. Why? Because at that time, we're talking 11%. And in 2018, the height of all of this tension, the polls have it at 12%, 11, 12%. That means 9 out of 10 Americans didn't think that China was an enemy. The vast majority of Americans, they don't have favorable attitudes, right, but they're not on the side of defining China.
They don't want to go to war.
That's right.
They don't want to go. They don't see them as enemies that we have to fight necessarily, at least at this point. But they see them as an economic enemy. They focus on the flaunting of WTO rules, right, and China's incredibly vulnerable there. And look, I've said that, all countries, on their way up in a development mode, all countries have broken the rules. And the United States is not an exception. They were, in the last century, the biggest violators or thieves of IP assets, from the British and Europeans. So we've all done that. It's part of the development state. But when I speak to Chinese audiences, I say, look, now you've developed, a certain amount of wealth, and it's very obvious to the developed world that you've developed a certain measure of wealth. It is now incumbent upon you to make amends explicitly for the violation of WTO.
The other point. Let me just make a quick point to build on what Bill has said here, and that is the notion that is pointed out, is addressed in the movie, is a lack of creativity. If you remember, the lack of creativity in education in China, and here's the thing that is going to happen as we see greater creativity emerging from China. That is when we will see a diminution in the kind of blatant intellectual property theft that we have seen, which is exactly what happened in the example going back 150 years when we saw what many have reported as even greater theft by the United States of British intellectual property. The example that is one of the most intriguing ones, but the benefit that came from it, is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens sued because of the fact that there were illegal printings of his publications in the United States. But guess what? Because of that intellectual property theft, Charles Dickens' publications being printed here, he made more money coming to the United States of America on a speaking tour than he did printing and selling his own writings in Great Britain. And so it's an interesting thing.
That's why Bill Gates famously said, I abhor the theft of intellectual property, especially in China. But if they're going to steal anyone's property,
Steal
I
mine.
sure hope it's mine.
Because there's an understanding of it throughout the world.
No, that's okay. Yeah, the question of creativity, there's plenty of creativity. That may also be a straw target, in this. But just to finish on the public opinion side.
Sure.
In 2016, these polls are hard to conduct and impossible to conduct today, but Pew conducts a poll in 2016, and we had over 40% of the Chinese population who were surveyed identifying the United States as a major threat. And what was striking about this poll is that over 45% of people between 18 and 34, the same group where half of these people have a favorable attitude towards the United States, describe the United States as a major threat. And so I'm curious, how that gets balanced. Here, the focus is on American opinion. We have several former government officials on the United States side. We have some business people. We have one former official from Hong Kong, but we don't have Chinese officialdom addressing this.
Let me answer that. So if there's one takeaway that I want the Chinese to take from this movie, it's that the America that Xi Jinping visited 30 years ago is an America that still exists today. It's an open America. It's a open-minded America. And I think what is one of the most curious things about those people who are characterized as the Trump voter that are ultimately the most pliable and open-minded.
Iowa nice.
Yeah, Iowa nice. And I think it's critical to the extent. I mean, I want two things to happen as a result of this. We didn't intend to make a film about America, but I think we ended up making a film about America. And I think, I want the Chinese to try harder in America, because that's a good thing. Because the one thing that we share with the Chinese, I think, at the real core is a frontier spirit. I think that is what really binds us together. And I think to the extent that the Chinese see that there are certainly pockets in America that are willing to, be open-minded and to embrace, a difference in an approach, an out-of-the-box approach, as we saw in Iowa, that will do more than anything else to change public opinion in China. I think it's crucial, absolutely crucial.
One of the criticisms leveled, people will say, is this movie pro-China? Is this movie pro-U.S.? And I always say that it is pro-U.S.-China relationship. And that's really what the focus has to be. And there are some in this country who infer from that, if you're in favor of the relationship, then that means it's pro-China. I mean, that's one of the criticisms level, but it's part of the challenge with which we have to contend. We're going to hear from the audience. We got lots.
We've got some questions, and so we may have more than we can manage right at the outset. But if I call on you, it's anyone's guess if any of these work. If I call on you, if you could give us your name and then get right to your question, please, up in the upper left here, my left.
Bob Jimenez, former journalist. I'm curious to know, Congressman and Bill, what...
Haven't seen you in a hell of a long time.
Well, I've been...
My gosh.
Same here. Quickly, what role do you think the American media plays in this whole movement to educate the middle class when we seem to be caught in this agenda-driven media?
Well, we saw the example, Bob, right there in Smithfield, with the notion of every single network came to do an interview. And when people said, well, let's explore this, let's see what's going to happen, it was all on the cutting room floor. But the moment someone would say, well, I just don't want a communist anywhere near my town, that was what was placed on the news. Why? Because it's provocative. And so it's your business. I mean, your former business, the business that you've been in. And I mean, so we obviously know that this is what creates this kind of provocation is what creates that. So we're hoping very much that we're going to be able to get some good media coverage of this movie. And, we'd like to get some good reviews and some attention on it.
Yeah, incidentally, after we finish here, those of you who are willing and interested, you can be interviewed outside about your reaction to the movie. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that.
No. I just, I think, let me just state the obvious. The Chinese people understand America a lot better than America understands China. And so I think one of the reasons, there are two reasons really why some people watch this film and they think it has a pro-China slant. We spend a lot more time explaining China than we do explaining America. But I rationalize that based on the fact that the understanding deficit is way greater in one direction than it is in the other.
Yeah, we definitely have a knowledge deficit. Let's, for geographic diversity, come over here to Dr. Yu-Fu Cheng.
Hi, thank you. My name is Yu-Fu Chen. I'm a China Country Director for R20 Regions of Climate Action, founded by former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. My personally is Chinese, but my kids are Americans. So for me, I like this movie a lot because it's pro-US-China relationship. Not US, not China, but a relationship. That bridge, that is a relationship need to build on. So I think that when a lot of people talk about the trade deficit.
We could, get to a question.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, in a lot of American ideas that think the U.S. and China, the trade deficit. I think the most time is due to the boss to pay the workers. Well, as a consumer, you are you're the boss. I think the question I want to ask both David and Bill is, for the movie to reach to China, I think there's a lot of layers that need to be convinced in China. What is the most difficult things?
Well, could I just ask you to tell us what you believe China's reaction will be to this movie? Because again, this is going to be opening in 4 weeks to 2,000 theaters in China.
I think the reaction will be excellent because I have a talk with a lot of government officials in the past and U.S. Government officials as well. I built a lot of U.S.-China summit. I also on the organizing committee. I can see it will be very well received. I will try my best to shoot many government leaders in China. Thank you.
So the question is, the consumer is boss. And so everybody wearing a China-made shirt is the employer. I'm not sure what your question was.
The question is, I think in your movie, how do the U.S. Audience can feel that we are paying the Chinese workers the money to get the raw material, to get the labor, to even get the sweat. So this is not the trade deficit. It is the salary the U.S. boss pay Chinese workers.
Okay, so American branded products and American factories and all of that.
And they're about to become our bosses with 600 million consumers, as Bill likes to say.
I'll tell you one thing that's interesting. I mean, we sort of feature the American apparel boss Doug Charney way before he got into his most recent trouble. But he was already in trouble when they talked. Yeah. When one thing that we one of the reasons we kept him in is because he was a folk hero because he kept jobs in America, and now that company's bankrupt. It's a height of irony that he stood by, died on the cross, and literally now his company is bankrupt. I think that's a lesson, and the lesson is, and we see this with the displacement of jobs from China to Africa, globalization is truly agnostic with respect to its victims.
Yeah, so, and as we see in this film, and so Charlie Wu is both an accidental and a purposeful diplomat.
Thank you. Charlie Wu.
Great diplomat.
I'm a toy manufacturer, and I have plants in China, but I have more employees in Los Angeles than I have in entire China. So that's just a comment. And it
It's
was,
okay to
I
clap
belong to a
about
group.
that.
I belong to a group here, Committee 100. I'm in the leaders here. I'm glad to be a part of this discussion.
We're happy that you're all here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great
So
to see
I
you,
just want to
Siwei.
add,
Mr.
in terms of
Chairman.
the public opinion polls, we also conduct public opinion polls. But although I'm not as famous as Pew, but we are very similar. I just want to share few quick comments. Americans favorable towards China, it's about 50-50. You know, it could go up to 55 to 45. It's always half and half. But when China, they're pretty overwhelmingly like the United States people. But if you ask the question whether they trust the United States, overwhelmingly negative. So there's a difference between government and people. When you break down the categories, you know, American public's favorable impression of China. If you look at the Washington, D.C. think tank, congressional staff, insider, overwhelmingly negative. Journalists, we actually pulled the journalists. They're overwhelmingly negative towards China. But if you look at the China side, government official journalists, they're even more favorable towards the United States than the...
So, Charlie, do you think that this movie is going to help to diminish that?
You know, because its attractiveness is people to people. You know why they don't trust the government? It's getting worse and worse. Is because when the trust level goes down, the perception in China that the U.S. is somehow trying to contain China, you're going to deprive China's opportunity in the global prosperity. That's the key point. You know why the journalists have such negative views about American journalists? China, because they got hung up on human rights and democracy and freedom of the press and openness. And in China, they don't look at it that way. So I think there's a lot of yes, I mean, to your question is, yes, it would be this will be well regarded in China because it's the people to people rather than the government involved.
Yeah,
I think it's also ignorance, and you know, I was reading a statistic the other day that 75% of journalists in this country that write about China have never visited China. I mean, it's shocking. It's actually shocking when you think about the world we live in that hasn't taken place. So I think there's a big understanding deficit.
Yeah, well, one of a couple of things. First of all, our institute has made 12 films on the question of journalists working in China, the challenges that they've faced, the successes they've had, the problems they've had, the mistakes they've made, that sort of thing. And so I'd encourage you to visit the USChina Institute website to see some of that assignment China. But those journalists are not the ones that you're just referring to. And I don't necessarily think you're even talking about journalists. You're talking about maybe 75% of now the commentariat. Everybody, as China has risen in importance, everybody has an opinion. And so we have a lot of people with limited experience who are commenting on it, and that's one of the purposes of the US-China Institute, is to try to inform public discussion with reliable and timely information. Let's go to Dr. Frank Wu.
Two very quick questions. Frank Wu, a colleague of Charlie Wu's, but not related to him. The first question is, there are millions of Chinese Americans. What can we do to be helpful to build bridges? And the second, just out of curiosity, what happened to wife number one?
Yeah, well, and also
the football coach.
Well, and I love that you're asking three white guys what Chinese Americans can do, but I leave that to you folks.
You mean as to what happened to wife number one?
And what happened? Did Peter make the team? Did Peter get recruited? I mean, there were so many questions, but no.
Well, those are all correct. Well, one thing, I mean, that's why I mentioned at the outset, I mean, as many of you were constituents of mine, and I was pleased to represent Arcadia, San Marino, Pasadena in the Congress, and on the evening of November 2nd, we are going to be screening this movie at a theater on Colorado Boulevard. We can get you all the information. But so we're going to be screening there. And so obviously bringing as many Chinese Americans as possible to this to be exposed to it. And I should tell you that next Wednesday evening, my very good friend and former colleague who actually chairs the Annenberg Dreier Commission, which is established at Sunnylands, Malcolm Clarke, who was the chief of staff for Bill Clinton, is going to be participating with me, along with Dave Rank, who was the immediate past deputy chief of mission in the People's Republic of China. So we're doing a screening at the Washington Press Club in Washington, D.C. next Wednesday, or next Tuesday evening, the 30th. And so we have this, and so we will try to make available to you as much information as we can as this process begins. So C100, clearly we will share this information. So anyone that you all have in Washington, D.C., who you think should come, we invite them to the Washington Press Club at 5:30 on October 30th that evening for the screening and conversation that Mac McClarty and Dave Rank and I are going to be having there.
He's better at product placement than I am. In fact, you can find out about these screenings and a whole lot of other things at the Institute website. We have continent-wide, so we include Canada in this mix. And so China-related activities, including film screenings such as this, and meetings at the National Press Club and elsewhere, you can find at china.usc.edu. But Bill has more to say.
I just want to say, I think we live in a world where the narrative has become way more important than facts, and where people emote rather than debate. And I think in that environment, the Chinese American community needs to figure out how to tell its story better. This is the opening salvo in what I hope will be many efforts to do that. When we interviewed Wang Jianlin, the one thing he said that that's just seared in my memory. He said it'll be 10 years before China becomes as big an economy as the United States. It'll be 20 to 30 years before China will have equivalent per capita income. And it'll be 50 years before China learns how to tell a story as well as the United States tells a story. That's your challenge. That is the challenge of the Chinese American community. Tell the story.
And another both accidental and purposeful diplomat, Ming Xie, trustee for the United States, U.S. For USC.
Thank you, Clayton, and thank you, Dave and William, presented this story. I think it will be well received, the story in China, but I think that the issue is not in China. It is how the story will be reviewed in the U.S. One caution is just make sure we not titled as another midterm election, Madeleine, the midterm election. No, I says if you wanted to go for the DC for the screening, invite the Wilson Institute.
Yes, well, you should know that the Chinese ambassador is going to be with us at the screening, and there are a number of people from the Woodrow Wilson Center who are going to be there too.
Yeah, that'd be great. And Gene Harmon, it is also another trustee of the U.S.
Right.
So I think the one is really, Bill, you mentioned the one is it is the media. How does the media react with the film? The film will be tell a true story. It is balanced story. I think now from my review point of view, China is placed the defense side. Is only react what the U.S. or this administration is doing. If we want to lower the temperature, temperature has to come down from Washington. It's not from China side.
That's exactly right. Can I just, before Bill responds, I want to tell my favorite Ming Xie story that I have. So we had breakfast with Henry Kissinger at the Nixon Library, and this was and Henry Kissinger dropped his fork on the floor, and Ming proceeded to tell the story about working in a field in China, listening to the speaker and hearing Henry Kissinger's voice on the speaker, and now here he is picking up the fork when we were sitting at breakfast with Henry Kissinger, and he was just talking about how incredible that transformation in his life has been. So that was one of my favorite stories.
So just on the question of what the American reaction will be to this film and how widely distributed this film, I know it's on everybody's mind. And maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, but I think we have the same two ingredients that another film, which way, way exceeded expectations, which was Inconvenient Truth. And what are those two ingredients? Al Gore ran for president. He ran basically on an environmental platform. He stoked the curiosity of the American public in this issue, and the American public understood simultaneously that they were very ignorant of it. And as a result, it completely outperformed expectation, did $110 million at the box office. You see the same confluence here. Donald Trump has stoked the China issue to a point where literally, if I make the mistake when I get into an Uber and I'm headed to LAX, and if I make the mistake of telling the Uber driver I'm going to China, they talk my head off for the entire time. That's never happened before. And so the curiosity is there and the ignorance is there. And so I think there's an appetite here for this. And I will give only one small piece of documentary evidence to my thesis right now, which is that 48 hours ago, we released the trailer to this film on YouTube. And in 48 hours, we had over 100,000 hits. I think really only the beginning.
So that's a reason for optimism. We have two questions, and these will have to be the last two questions up here in the back. First, if we could go to Dr. Xu Xin.
Hi, my name is Xu Xin from Nanjing University. Came to visit the United States 2 weeks ago. Now this is my last stop in United States. My question is that you mentioned the movie was prepared way before Trump get into position. And my question is, will you do it differently if you make it after Trump, the position was taken about China?
Okay, that
to tell a different story
that wasn't done.
Because as you said, 95% were made already done.
Well, but the story is the story and the message is identical because, as Bill pointed out, Donald Trump did not create this sentiment. He brought it to the forefront. So I don't think that there would be many changes. Obviously, Donald Trump is mentioned in the movie, since he's become president, and there is this message of hope at the very end. And so the sentiment that exists today has existed before Donald Trump.
Okay, that I agree. Because I remember just a year and a half ago, I was asked for a meeting and a survey by central government. I was being to this country to ask me to say, what's you feel that opinion about Xi Jinping come to power since 18-party Congress. So I really tell them three things. I failed. That was almost 2.5 years ago. So that's what I think in that way. But certainly Trump's position or measure took really changed the course. But still, I believe, as some of you, if you ask Chinese personal opinion or they do yourself, one thing we can judge is the Chinese attitude towards United States is that if they want to send their children to any other country freely, where they will go, I could say, if possible, at least 70 to 80% Chinese want to send children to come to the United States. And that's probably tells something.
Yes, and Professor Xu is right. We're fortunate to have more than 5,000 students from China studying here at USC. Thank you. In Sun.
If I may take a 30 seconds period, I believe in fair trade, not the trade war. That's the wrong way that Donald Trump is pushing it. One short 20-second story is after the Second World War, U.S. was going to help more Japan and Germany. Tell them, we'll give you free goods, will be a cheaper goods, so people will buy and happy. And their politician says, no thank you. Our people need a job. They have on their income and they have to live, and we have to bring our economy. Now, in U.S. is a trade deficit is how many? U.S. government cannot pay federal employees without borrowing money every year. So, and then we say, oh, there's a lot of jobs and the economy is good, whatever. Once the stock falls down, our economy will be just wiped out. So what do you suggest? We have a fair trade and everybody has a living wage and live happily. Thank you.
Well, my view is that free trade is fair trade. I believe the freer the trade exists, the fairer it actually is. I mean, that's my my perspective on it. Lenny Sands, I think, wanted to say. I saw your hand up, Lenny.
Sands, 40 years going to China.
Yeah,
and as I mentioned earlier, Lenny was on the Export Council for one of the top leaders there for President
What I
Bush.
wanted to say was that a very important observation here about China and the Chinese people is that they're curious and they love to learn. And we're in a great institution. So it's up to us to teach and to get your narrative out. So I say social media, cram it and get it out. You'll get millions of people. It's going to be all of us that are going to create the narrative, not government.
I agree. Right. Thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Lenny. Great way to end it. Thank you very, very much.
Lenny Sands is known as a marketing genius.
Yes, he is.
So, ladies and gentlemen.
He's just a genius.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you because you could have been watching a baseball game. You could have been doing any number of other things. But you've come here. You've come here because you recognize what I think we all believe, that the U.S.-China relationship is too important to be left to politicians. It's too important to be ignored. We must do what we can. And there are problems. There are big issues. Not all of them have been addressed here tonight, but we welcome you to be a part of the US-China Institute community and to be a part now of this Better Angels. I think all of you are better angels. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Great job.